This is an overview of the Nikon D80 digital SLR camera. And here it is. The first thing to point out is that the Nikon D80 range was launched in August 2006, and that makes them around about 5 years old. They are going to be slightly dated compared to the more up-to-date ranges of SLR cameras that are available, but the advantage being they are obviously a lot more cheaper. So this could be an ideal way to get into SLR photography if you haven't used a camera such as this before. And here we have the D80 with a Nikon 55-200mm lens attached to it. The D80 is a 10.2 megapixel camera. The weight of the actual body itself is 585 grams, and that is potentially lighter than a number of the lenses you could potentially attach to a camera such as this. As a result of its light weight, it's not surprising to find that the actual body of the camera is made out of plastic. If you wanted to get a sturdier camera body with a metal casing, you're probably looking at something like a Nikon D200 or one of its more modern counterparts. On the back of the camera you've got a 2.5 inch LCD screen, which is a pretty good size, and the Nikon D80 takes SD memory cards, and it's worth pointing out that its predecessor, the Nikon D70, used compact flash, so there is a change in memory format. So just to briefly point out some of the buttons and functions on the D80. With the on-off switch at the top, if you slide it beyond on, that turns on the light for the readout panel at the top of the camera. Very useful in low light conditions. You have your standard buttons across the top for the timer, for example. There is a slider at the back, or slider wheel at the back, as well as at the front. Very useful and easy to use if the camera's in manual mode, for example, and you can adjust the shutter speed and the aperture size just with your thumb and index finger. Your autofocus lock at the top there. Standard navigation wheel, very plasticky. You can only move it up, down, left, right when you're looking at a picture. If you had a D200 though, you'd be able to move in the diagonals as well. Standard multi-purpose buttons on the left. It's worth pointing out that the D80, shutter speed of the D80 ranges from 30 seconds all the way up to 1/4000. And this actually is not as fast as its predecessor, the D70. The D70 could take pictures at 1/8000, and the more modern and recent cameras also go up to 1/8000, so it's a slightly slower camera. I want to show you some examples of photos taken with the Nikon D80. All these photos here are taken either with a Nikon 18-55mm, 55-200mm or 70-300mm lens. So they are pretty standard lenses. Now, the thing that impressed me was the colour and the saturation of these images. They're really bright and vibrant, and yeah, the colour levels are pretty impressive. Pictures are sharp. That might be down to the lenses more than the camera itself, but overall I was very impressed with the image quality. So just to give you a brief understanding of where the D80 sits in the Nikon family of SLR cameras, its predecessor was the Nikon D70. The D70, obviously being quite a lot older, took 6 megapixel images as a maximum resolution. It had things like a smaller viewfinder, a smaller LCD screen on the back. The one advantage of the D70 over the D80 though was that it had a slightly faster shutter speed, and it would take pictures at 1/8000 as opposed to this one, which only goes up to 1/4000. The more recent version, so the one after this, is the D90, and you can still buy that new today. It's obviously a lot more expensive because this model is discontinued. But the advantages of the D90 over the D80 would be that it's slightly higher resolution. It was at 12 megapixels. You could take video with the D90 up to 720p, which is quite useful. It had a great little function on it though, the D90, in terms of a sensor cleaning function. So what happens is you get dust on the sensor itself within the camera, and on the D90 you can actually clean that sensor automatically, and it basically just shakes the sensor and it just knocks all the dust off. So the D80 doesn't have that function, but the D90 does. It's also got a slightly bigger LCD screen at the back of the camera as well. Now, just to compare it to one other camera, there was the Nikon D200, and that was launched pretty much at the same time as the D80. Now, they both have the same quality sensor inside them, so they both take 10 megapixel images. The main advantage, though, of the D200 over the D80 was its build quality. It had a metal body as opposed to plastic, so it was a lot sturdier, and it had better placed buttons, and how to access the various functions of the camera were a bit easier. Also, the navigation cursors at the back of the camera on the D200 is superior to that on the D80. Now, there are many manufacturers of digital SLR cameras, but probably the main competitor to Nikon is Canon, and I just wanted to show you a brief example of a Canon digital camera. So here's the D80 that I've been talking about. This one here is a Canon 20D, which as well is a discontinued camera. It's slightly older than the D80, and you could buy it at a price probably slightly cheaper. Both Nikon and Canon take excellent quality photographs, so typically I think it's generally a question of personal preference as to which make of camera you prefer to use, and that's going to come down to things like the layout of the various functions on the camera and which you find easier to access. But anyway, here is the Canon 20D, and just to show that the layout of the camera is pretty similar. There are slight differences between the two manufacturers, but accessing the various functions you will probably find that they are generally similar. So if you are stuck trying to decide between which brand to go for, I would recommend going into a shop and actually trying both types of cameras out yourself to see which one feels more comfortable to use. In terms of price, the Nikon D80 here is a discontinued model, so you can't buy that new anymore. But to buy it used or refurbished, it would typically cost between £280 to £350. The Nikon D70, which is the older model still, is obviously a lot cheaper, and that would cost about £170. The Nikon D90, which was the newer version of this one, is still available new. It's a current model, and that would cost about £600 new. However, if you were to buy it used or refurbished, that reduces the price probably to around about the £500 mark. Lastly, there was the Nikon D200, and again the D200 is very similar to the D80 in terms of image quality, the only difference being you get a superior build quality and there's a better layout of the various buttons and functions on the camera, and that would cost typically around about £350. So that's the Nikon D80 digital camera. In conclusion, really impressed with the image quality. Pictures taken with this camera are very vibrant and full of colour. The saturation levels are spot on, so it's really good. The image quality is really good. It will vary slightly depending upon what lens you have on the camera, obviously, but the image quality is pretty good with this camera. It's a bit fiddly though. I mean, there's a lot of buttons on here, and when you first get the camera you're a bit confused as to what button does what, and it takes a while to learn where the buttons are placed. But once you use this repeatedly for a while, it does become second nature. I would say it's probably a very good camera, entry-level camera to get into SLR photography if you haven't done this sort of photography before. It's going to be cheaper than buying, say, one of the current new models out there, so it's probably quite a good way to get into photography. And probably the cheapest way to go about getting a camera like this would probably be in a bundle, so you buy the camera and you buy a number of lenses at the same time. And if it's a used camera and used lenses, provided the condition's good, you can save yourself quite a lot of money doing that. But I think if it was me, I would probably get a Nikon D200 over the D80. My reasons for this being that even though the image quality is the same between the two cameras, the build quality of the D200 and the layout of the buttons I think is better, and you'll find it easier to use. It is slightly more expensive, but not a huge amount, so I think it's probably worth paying the extra 50 quid and going for the D200 instead. But saying that, if you have the opportunity to get a D80, it's still a very good camera and one you'll enjoy taking photographs with. So there we go, that's the overview of the Nikon D80. If you liked this review, you can check out more of them if you go to my YouTube channel, which is SLR Lens. Thanks.